High on the Pakistan-China border, where storms swallow entire expeditions and the air itself feels razor-thin, stands a mountain that has earned a reputation even Everest fears. K2. For decades, climbers have called it the Savage Mountain, a place where a single mistake is final and where the weather can turn triumph into tragedy in minutes. Among all the stories carved into its icy walls, few are as haunting, as debated, or as fiercely emotional as the final climb of British alpinist Alison Hargreaves. Alison was not just another climber chasing a summit. By 1995, she was already a legend, the first woman to solo the north face of the Eiger, a mother of two, and a mountaineer whose skill earned respect even in the toughest circles of high-altitude climbing. Her decision to attempt K2 without supplemental oxygen or high-altitude porters made headlines around the world. It wasn't arrogance, it was who she was: pure, uncompromising, and committed to meeting the mountain on its own terms. When she arrived at base camp, teams whispered about the storms rolling in, about jet stream winds strong enough to tear tents apart. But Alison pressed forward, moving steadily up the mountain's steep ridges and exposed faces. Those who met her during those early days said she carried a quiet determination, a calmness that made others trust her judgment, even as the weather began to turn. The day she reached the summit should have been a triumph etched in history. Instead, it became the beginning of one of mountaineering's most painful mysteries: how a world-class climber vanished in the death zone, and why her partner's accounts would later ignite a firestorm of controversy. Stay with K2 Stories as we revisit this climb with clarity, respect, and the truth hidden behind the storm. By late July of 1995, K2's base camp had settled into the tense rhythm that only the world's most dangerous mountain can create. Climbers from multiple countries were waiting for what they hoped would be a brief weather window. The season had already been brutal. Jet stream winds hammered the upper slopes, and storm systems kept sweeping in from the Karakoram, burying high camps and forcing teams to retreat again and again. Among the waiting climbers was Alison Hargreaves, who had already acclimatized and was preparing for a summit attempt that would test even her extraordinary skill. Alison had joined forces loosely with several climbers on the mountain, including an American team and a Spanish group that had made significant progress toward Camp 4. As often happens on K2, teams shift, merge, and divide depending on the conditions and the personalities involved. According to multiple interviews conducted after the tragedy, Alison was climbing largely independently but moved in parallel with climbers like Rob Slater of the United States, Javier Oliver of Spain, and a small group of other high-altitude veterans who believed the long-awaited weather window might finally be approaching. On July 30th, the mountain appeared, if only for a moment, to show mercy. Winds dropped, clouds parted, and the summit, a jagged python of ice and rock, emerged above the storm line. Climbers at Camp 3 radioed base camp with cautious optimism. The window might hold long enough for a final push. It was the chance everyone had been hoping for. The ascent to Camp 4 on the shoulder was grueling, even by K2 standards. The route was loaded with fresh snow, unstable and prone to slab avalanches. Climbers broke trails slowly, taking turns kicking steps into the waist-deep drifts. Several reports from that day describe Alison as strong, calm, and methodical, often moving ahead to help establish the track. She had climbed without supplemental oxygen throughout her career, and though the air was painfully thin, she showed no signs of slowing down. When the group reached Camp 4, exhausted but hopeful, the sky above them was deceptively clear. The following morning, Alison and the small cluster of climbers made their summit attempt. According to later accounts, the wind was low, the sky was sharp blue, and for the first time all season, K2 looked almost gentle. Climbers spread out along the route above the shoulder, each moving at their own pace toward the summit pyramid. Sometime in the early afternoon, Alison reached the top of K2 standing on the peak of the Savage Mountain without oxygen, a feat only a handful of climbers had ever achieved. She radioed down a brief message, her voice thin but steady in the death zone's brutal air. It was, by all accounts, a moment of triumph. But on K2, reaching the summit is only the midpoint. The descent is where most tragedies unfold. As the group began downclimbing, the first hints of trouble appeared. Winds that had been nearly calm began to rise. High cirrus clouds streaked across the sky, an omen every veteran climber recognizes. By late afternoon, according to several interviews, the winds had strengthened dramatically, slamming the exposed ridges with hurricane-force gusts. Climbers were pushed to their knees. Ice crystals blasted their faces. The summit window had slammed shut faster than anyone expected. What happened next became the center of controversy in the months and years after. The storm hit with such violence that climbers were forced to descend almost blindly. Some reports describe climbers losing sight of each other within seconds. Others spoke of long periods of isolation, crouched against the wind, waiting for brief lulls to move. According to the later statements given by surviving climbers, the storm's intensity made coordinated movement nearly impossible. Each climber was fighting for survival in conditions where even standing upright was a battle. When rescued climbers eventually returned to base camp, journalists and later investigators sought to understand how Alison had vanished. Conflicting accounts emerged, not necessarily out of bad intent, but because each survivor had witnessed only fragments of the chaos. Some climbers recalled seeing her descending behind them. Others believed she had been blown from the ridge. A few suggested she may have fallen from the exposed traverse beneath the summit pyramid, a place where the drop is thousands of feet straight down. But none of these versions aligned perfectly. The storm had erased the mountain's usual landmarks, turning the descent into a maze of white. As the news spread around the world, speculation filled the gaps left by the missing details. Some newspapers hinted at disagreements among the group earlier in the climb. Others questioned whether teamwork had broken down in the death zone. According to several high-altitude historians, the public confronted with the tragedy of a world-famous climber and mother sought answers in places where none could be confirmed, and because the surviving climbers' testimonies differed in certain key moments. These inconsistencies became fertile ground for interpretation. Yet the hard truth remained. K2 had unleashed one of its sudden, unforgiving storms. And in that storm, 6 climbers, Alison Hargreaves among them, disappeared forever. Though the controversies would continue for years, those who understood K2 best agreed on one point. In the death zone above the shoulder, where oxygen is scarce and survival depends on split-second decisions, even the strongest climbers can be overpowered by the mountain's wrath. In the days following the storm, the upper slopes of K2 fell silent. Base camp, once a buzzing hub of radio updates, weather warnings, and logistical chatter, became a place of dread. Teams scanned the mountain through telescopes, searching for any sign movement on the shoulder. A flash of brightly colored fabric, the faint flicker of a headlamp in the night. But the mountain gave nothing back. The storm had carved an impenetrable wall between the world below and the climbers who had vanished in the death zone. Back home in Britain, news of Alison's disappearance spread with heartbreaking speed. She wasn't just a climber, she was a public figure, a symbol of talent and determination, and a mother whose pursuit of the world's highest peaks had always drawn strong opinions. The moment her name appeared on the front pages, a tidal wave of questions followed. How could someone so skilled simply disappear? Why did no one return with clearer answers? Who had been with her in those final moments? And why did the accounts from the mountain seem so fragmented? To understand the storm of controversy that followed, it's important to understand the reality of high-altitude climbing on K2. At 8,000 meters, the brain slows, balance falters, judgment becomes unreliable. And when a storm strikes, the priority for every climber becomes survival, one step, one anchor, one breath at a time. Coordinated rescues in these conditions are rare because even attempting them often guarantees additional deaths. Many mountaineers and historians emphasized this in interviews after the tragedy. But for the public, witnessing the disappearance of such a celebrated climber Explanations rooted in the brutal mechanics of high-altitude survival felt insufficient. The first wave of conflicting details arrived via interviews given by the surviving climbers. Each person had endured extreme conditions, each had descended alone for portions of the route. Their perspectives naturally varied. One climber recalled seeing Alison just below the summit, appearing strong but visibly fatigued. Another suggested she had been blown off her feet by the force of the wind. A third believed she was last spotted near the infamous bottleneck, the narrow, deadly passage beneath serric walls that have claimed many lives. None of these accounts directly contradicted the others, but the differences in timing and location created space for doubt. Journalists, driven by the intensity of public interest, began comparing the statements side by side. Some articles pointed out that the timeline was unclear. Others published speculative headlines suggesting that questions remained unanswered. About the final hours, a few outlets went further, implying tension or miscommunication among the climbers during the ascent. Though these articles often relied on partial information or second-hand reports, they shaped public perception dramatically. In the weeks that followed, as more interviews were published, additional details emerged, but instead of providing clarity, they deepened the sense of mystery. One climber mentioned hearing shouting in the wind, though he couldn't tell who it came from. Another insisted that descending together would have been impossible in the storm's ferocity. A third said he believed Alison had been just minutes behind him, but lost sight when the whiteout grew so complete that he could no longer see his own feet. These accounts were not evidence of wrongdoing. They reflected the chaos of a storm that had overtaken even elite climbers. But in a story already overshadowed by grief, the inconsistencies became fuel for debate. For Alison's family, especially her partner and her young children, the weeks after the tragedy were devastating. They read the reports, watched the interviews, and tried to reconcile the differing narratives. Some statements offered comfort. Others raised painful questions. A few journalists began to explore whether gender played a role in the scrutiny surrounding her death, whether the public held her to a different standard because she was a mother. Several historians and mountaineers later commented on this angle, noting that male climbers who died on K2 rarely faced the same level of posthumous questioning about their motivations or responsibilities. Meanwhile, within the climbing community itself, the tragedy prompted difficult conversations. Some climbers defended the surviving team members, arguing that no one could be expected to act heroically in a storm powerful enough to rip anchors from the ice. Others quietly debated whether earlier decisions, such as the timing of the summit push or the choice to ascend despite signs of shifting weather, should have been reconsidered. These debates were nuanced and often respectful, but when reported by newspapers, they sometimes appeared sharper than intended. One of the most sensitive points emerged from the fact that Alison had climbed without supplemental oxygen. Some critics argued incorrectly. Many experts insisted that this choice made her more vulnerable during the descent. In reality, the controversy partly grew from misunderstanding. Alison had built her career on oxygen-free ascents, and K2's lower oxygen pressure was simply the next step in her long-established mountaineering philosophy. But as conversations about her final hours continued, this detail was repeatedly mentioned, sometimes as context, sometimes as criticism, and occasionally as a misunderstanding that blurred the public narrative further. As August passed and hope of finding survivors faded, a final report on the season was compiled from interviews, base camp logs, and radio transmissions. It confirmed what many had already accepted. The storm that, as summer turned to autumn and the camps on K2 were dismantled, the mountain remained eerily quiet. The climbers who survived the 1995 season carried their own private storms home, with them images of whiteout winds, deafening gusts, and the helplessness that comes with knowing the mountain, not human decision, delivered the final verdict. But for the families of those who never returned, silence was not enough. They needed answers. They needed a narrative that made sense of the incomprehensible. And slowly, the tragedy of that July began to take shape in the public consciousness, built from the fragments left behind. In the months that followed, Climbing journals published long, detailed retrospectives pieced together from interviews, expedition logs, and first-hand accounts. These reports painted a picture of a season defined by instability, unpredictable weather, deep snow, shifting alliances between teams, and the constant knowledge that the margin for error on K2 was far narrower than on Everest. Alison's decision to push for the summit was consistent with her career, measured, methodical, and rooted in years of high-altitude experience. But once she disappeared, the nature of her final climb was examined through a lens that was rarely applied to other climbers. Part of this scrutiny came from the public's fascination with her remarkable achievements. She had recently completed a solo ascent of Everest without supplemental oxygen her feet. That cemented her legacy. She was articulate, charismatic, and had a way of communicating the purity of climbing that resonated with audiences far beyond mountaineering circles. When she set foot on K2, journalists around the world took notice, and after her disappearance, this attention only intensified as newspapers revisited the tragedy. Some reporters focused on the emotional dimension. They interviewed friends, family members, and veteran climbers who had known Alison for years. Many described her as disciplined and exceptionally skilled, a climber who understood risk better than most. Others spoke about her deep love for her children and her fierce independence. These portraits were complex, nuanced, and deeply human. But as different perspectives circulated, conflicting interpretations emerged. One topic that repeatedly resurfaced in news coverage was the question of decision-making during the summit push. Several accounts stated that the weather window had been shorter than expected. Some suggested that the warning signs were visible early on, thin clouds streaking across the sky, subtle shifts in the wind patterns, and the kind of stillness that often precedes K2's notorious storms. Yet others insisted that the conditions that morning had been unusually stable, presenting the best chance for a summit attempt in weeks. These discrepancies were not unusual. High-altitude weather often changes so rapidly that climbers in different positions on the mountain can experience entirely different conditions. But as the public sought a clear explanation, the lack of uniformity fueled speculation. Questions also rose about the dynamics between teams. Climbers from the Spanish, American, and British groups had all moved in the same general patterns that season, and on K2, collaboration is often fluid rather than formal. Yet some reports emphasized moments of tension, disagreements over timing, concerns about avalanche risk, or debates about whether to wait another day. While most of these were typical in any expedition, interpretations varied. Some commentators framed them as minor differences amplified by the stress of the climb. Others, especially in media narratives, hinted that underlying disagreements may have influenced decisions on summit day. It was a narrative thread that attracted attention, even though none of the documented accounts provided evidence of significant discord. The greatest uncertainty, however, centered on the descent. The surviving climbers' recollections differed not because of deception, but because of the storm itself. At 8,000 meters, memory becomes unreliable. Visibility becomes non-existent. The mind works in fragments. Later interviews reflected this reality. Some climbers remembered seeing others at specific points. Others believed they were alone. A few recalled hearing voices. Others insisted the wind was too loud to hear anything at all. When newspapers compared these accounts, they appeared contradictory. But to high-altitude experts, the inconsistencies were unsurprising. Still, as these differing fragments reached the public, a narrative gap formed, one that some readers interpreted as evidence of confusion, and others interpreted as something more troubling. In a few cases, headlines leaned into the ambiguity, suggesting that questions remained about how the climbers had become separated, or why certain decisions were made. While the articles themselves often included careful nuance, the emotional impact of the headlines endured. For Alison's family, these contradictions were especially painful. In interviews, her partner expressed frustration with the lack of clarity. He wanted to understand the sequence of events, to build a coherent picture of her final hours. But the more he learned, the more the accounts diverged. Some climbers insisted Alison had been descending steadily and appeared strong. Others believed she had been struggling. A few thought she was only minutes behind them. Others were uncertain if she had already fallen. Without a body, without witnesses, without consistent testimony, there was simply no way to know. But among all these uncertainties, one element remained consistent across nearly every account. The storm was beyond anything the climbers had anticipated. Winds powerful enough to fling a person from their footing. Temperatures plummeting so quick. As the years passed, the story of Alison Hargreaves' final climb did not fade. Instead, it settled into that rare category of mountaineering tragedies that remain fixed in the public imagination, part triumph, part mystery, part unresolved ache. Every few years, a new article, a television documentary, or a book revisited the events of 1995, piecing together the same fragments, finding new angles, and, at times, reopening old wounds. Each retelling served as a reminder that the full truth of what happened high above the shoulder on K2 might never be known. One of the most enduring aspects of the story was the way people interpreted Alison's motivations. Some admired her for her courage, for her insistence on climbing in the purest style, without oxygen or porters, relying only on her own strength. They saw her as a pioneer climber who refused to compromise her values even on the world's most dangerous mountain. Others questioned her choices more critically, wondering whether the risks she took were justified, especially as a mother. It was a debate that long predated her K2 climb. Even during her lifetime, press interviews sometimes asked her why she pursued such dangerous goals. Her responses were always thoughtful, grounded in the deep personal meaning that climbing held for her. But after her death, these conversations took on a sharper edge. Some commentators saw her as a symbol of ambition. Others saw her as a symbol of sacrifice. And the people closest to her were left to navigate this public conversation while privately mourning a woman whose life was far richer and more complex than any debate could capture. Within the climbing community, the discussions about the 1995 season became more introspective. Still, the controversies remained, not because of scandal, and not because of evidence pointing to fault, but because the storm had created a vacuum of clarity, and human beings, especially in moments of great loss, naturally tried to fill those vacuums. In interviews years later, some of the surviving climbers spoke openly about the weight of those contradictions. A few expressed regret, not regret for their actions, but regret that they could not offer the clarity the public wanted. Others reflected on survivors' guilt, describing the difficulty of revisiting memories shaped by exhaustion, hypoxia, and terror. Their accounts didn't resolve the inconsistencies. They illuminated them, showing how trauma distorts perspective, and how even honest recollections can conflict when filtered through extreme conditions. Meanwhile, Alison's children grew up with their mother's story woven into their own identities. Her son, Tom, later became a professional climber himself, following in her footsteps with a quiet resolve that echoed hers. He spoke of her legacy with admiration, but also with the calm maturity of someone who had learned to live with questions that would likely never be answered. In later interviews, he acknowledged that the conflicting accounts were painful to read when he was young, but as he matured, he came to understand how the mountain and the storm could fracture even the strongest memories. His reflections added something rare to the public narrative: acceptance. Acceptance that the story of his mother's final hours was not intentionally obscured. Acceptance that K2, not a climber, decided the outcome. Acceptance that the ambiguity itself was part of the truth. Over time, the climbing world shifted how it talked about Alison. The controversies did not disappear, they remained part of the historical record, part of the media's response, part of the world's reaction to losing a beloved figure. But gradually, the focus returned to her accomplishments, her groundbreaking climbs, and the inspiration she gave to mountaineers round the globe. Her legacy was not defined by the tragedy, but by the decades of extraordinary achievements that preceded it. Still, there was one element that kept her story alive in a unique way: the symbolic weight of K2 itself. The savage mountain has always been a place where human ambition collides with forces far beyond control. Its tales of triumph, disaster, mystery, and heartbreak often blur the line between the known and the unknowable, and Alison's story became one of its defining chapters, representing not just the hazards of climbing, but the emotional complexity that follows a loss without closure. In climbing literature, the tragedy began to serve as a case study for the limits of human perception. In extreme environments, experts dissected the weather patterns of that day. Historians reconstructed timelines from the thinnest pieces of evidence. Psychologists examined the way trauma affects memory, especially when multiple people experience the same catastrophe but recall it differently. None of these analyses provided definitive answers, but together they helped transform the public conversation from one of suspicion to one of understanding. Understanding that contradictions can exist without malice. Understanding that memory falters in the death zone. Understanding that K2 is a master at